Hello and welcome to a video cast from the American Academy of Otolaryngology, Head and Neck Surgery Foundation, publisher of Otolaryngology-Head and Neck Surgery. This video cast is entitled How to Be a Star Reviewer, or How to Review Journal Manuscripts, and it is intended as a companion piece to the article published in 2010 in Otolaryngology-Head and Neck Surgery of the same title, How to Review Journal Manuscripts. And I'm delighted to be joined today by three expert reviewers who will assist us. Cecelia Schmalbach, who is a star reviewer and recently promoted to associate editor. Dr. Jack Krouse, who is a very seasoned expert, associate editor and critical reviewer. And Matt Ryan, who is also a multiple star reviewer with the journal many times and has now been promoted to associate editor. So all of you, thank you for being here and sharing your expertise. And what I'd like to do with all of you is get your insights, all the little secrets and tips that have helped you become great reviewers, and share that with the audience. So maybe, Cecelia, we'll start with you. You get a manuscript in your queue, you review it. What's the first thing you look at in the manuscript? How do you sort of walk your way through it? You look at the abstract, you look at the methods. What's the sort of sequence you use to guide yourself?
Sure. I really begin it on the first page of the manuscript and try and read the abstract of the entire manuscript in its entirety one time through, just sort of making some check marks of things that I'd like to go back to, maybe some references they've made that eventually I'll look up. But I try and go through it once and get a broad overview, and really as I'm doing that, I'm starting to think, is this appropriate for our journal? Is this going to help our readers out?
Okay, so one of the first questions, and we list this in our requirements, is the manuscript relevant to the journal? Does it fit the mission? Jack, you've been doing this a long time. How often do you find that things are just simply irrelevant, and is that an important thing to look at first? And if it's not relevant, what should a reviewer do?
Well, I think it is relevant, and when you receive the abstract, what I really like to do is get a sense of what the authors are trying to study and what their conclusions are. And if you have something where the article really is not in the clinical content area you would like to see, or if it's too technically done, or if it's a basic science topic that's really outside the scope of what we're trying to have our readers get, then I will sometimes say this back to the authors: this is really not relevant for our journal, for our readership.
Okay. So if it's not relevant, it doesn't make sense to do a detailed review. Simply state it's outside the scope of the journal, and maybe provide a few basic comments, but move on. Matt, we sort of skipped over this, but you open your inbox and there's an invitation to review. Do you jump for joy and automatically accept it, or how would you advise potential reviewers to sort of consider that invitation and make a decision about whether they're going to review, not review, accept, decline?
Well, the first step is, in that review invitation, the abstract is included, and so I will review the abstract to make sure that the submitted paper matches my area of expertise, or it's an area in which I feel like I can comment with some knowledge. And if I'm assigned something that doesn't really fit with my general knowledge, then I'll reject that manuscript.
Reject meaning you'll decline the opportunity to review.
Yes,
okay.
Yes, I'll reject the invitation.
I would also add that probably as potential reviewers, you should honestly assess your own time available. And if you're not going to have time to do a review, which could take several hours, then decline promptly and let it move on to the next person. Don't accept and then let it sit in your box and smolder away, which is inconsiderate to the authors. Let's move on to the second element of good reviews, which has to do with really looking at the validity of the work, often the internal validity. Is it a reasonable paper? Did they have appropriate methods? Analyze the data? Can we really believe the results for the people studied? Jack, what's the starting point that you go to try and determine that validity aspect for a manuscript?
Well, once I've read the abstract and I have a sense again of what they're claiming or what their outcome is, I'll go back and look at the methods section. I'll see how that was constructed. I really want to see, was the sample selected appropriately? Was the sample representative of the population that they're trying to comment on? Did they, how do they control the study that was done? And then once I get a sense of sort of how, if the structure was valid, then did they use appropriate statistical methods based on that in order to reach conclusions? Did they have sufficient power, meaning were there enough subjects in the study to make a meaningful comment from? Mm-hmm. And then it allows me to go back to look at those outcomes that they've claimed and to judge with some degree of certainty or uncertainty whether that was something that really, whether those comments could be accurately made based upon the design.
A very methodical approach that really begins with the method section and teases that apart. Is that what you do as well, Cecelia, or do you have a little different emphasis or technique you apply?
No, I think Dr. Krouse summarized it nicely. I take a very similar approach, and then I also tend to go to similar studies that are already in the literature. For me, that gives me a good idea of, is this cohort, for example, that's being described in the paper realistic? Are there other papers where there are studies that are 3- and 4-fold larger? And that helps give me a sense of what the contribution is going to be. And that probably applies more to external validity, so I don't mean to jump the gun. But that's another thing that I do consider.
Matt, anything to add that elaborate on those points?
Well, I think what I like to do when I'm reading the abstract and the introduction section is look for a hypothesis and see if there's a clearly defined hypothesis for the study. And then from that, you can look to see if the methods have been designed in such a way that that hypothesis is actually tested. To reiterate what Dr. Krouse said, you can look at the conclusions of the study and then work backwards and see if the conclusions are actually supported by the data in the manuscript. And not uncommonly, there is a mismatch between what the data really shows and what the authors conclude. So I will sometimes work from front to back and backwards to forwards. And I usually, with my reviews, will I'll look at the paper a couple of different times, and usually I like to let a few days elapse between viewing of the manuscript, and what that does for me is gives me time to get a little perspective and think about the paper.
Well, those are all great points, and I appreciate that you want to start, and if you can't really understand why they did the study really early on, then there's a problem. So I'm going to assume, Matt, that when you get the manuscript, which I believe is in your queue now, on our experience with 37,000 cases of hullabaloo disease and Hotchkiss treatment, the Kalamazoo experience, that is not going to probably excite you too much. I would hope not, at least. Anyway, moving on, so we've established the manuscript is relevant. We're going to review it. It seems to be hopefully internally valid, appropriate design. And next, as Cecelia indicated, we're going to move on to external validity. If we publish this manuscript, can it change patient care? Can it really move from the principle of just observations to generalizations about managing patients other than those in the study? Or can we extend the observations, if it's a basic science paper, to help with translational work and other clinical studies? Since you brought it up, Cecelia, what's the things you look at to determine if this is a manuscript that could be extended or improve care?
Sure. That's where I really rely upon essentially the inclusion and exclusion criteria. So going back to your great example of the Kalamazoo experience, does Kalamazoo translate out to the entire United States and also all the other countries as well? And sometimes I actually find that one of the flaws within the manuscript is that the inclusion and or exclusion criteria is not even defined. And then it's really hard to determine your external validity. But that would be the main way that I weight that.
So really, you need to know that sample, how they selected them, and then can it apply based on that. Jack, additions?
I would agree. I think that's the approach that I would take as well. And I think when we see manuscripts, often the sample appears to be very narrowly drawn. And as Cecelia said, it's very hard to take this narrowly drawn population or sample and move forward into the larger population. And many times it's just, this becomes the key to me. So generalizability and external validity, I think we need to judge carefully and importantly.
So the selection criteria for the patients, the sampling scheme, if it was a consecutive or randomized sample, probably better than just the people who happened to be hanging outside that morning, or a convenience sample. And Matt, maybe you can comment on something that's dear to my heart, the whole confidence interval issue. You like to study enough subjects that you can have some reasonable confidence in your estimate of a population parameter, of a real value out there, and that confidence interval is going to give you a range of plausible values for that population parameter. Does that help in deciding how robust this is and whether we can generalize the results, in your opinion?
It does, and it gives you a lot of information that you don't get from a simple p-value. And I think for many years we have focused on the p-value as being the important statistic to tell us whether a result is statistically significant. And yet that p-value doesn't give you as much information as a 95% confidence interval. So that is a focus of the journal, to try to make sure we include 95% confidence intervals.
Great. We've now established the article is relevant, it's properly conducted, and it seems to be hopefully generalizable. Next question, and these questions are listed in our instructions to authors, is does it improve the level of evidence beyond what we already have? And I think, again, Cecelia, you sort of hinted at this. I don't want to belabor this point because I think it's pretty straightforward, but it's incumbent to say, how does this add? If the knowledge does not add, there's no point publishing this. Do any of you have comments on that, or should we move beyond?
I think I have a comment to make. When I'm looking in the discussion section, in particular, I want to see if the authors are able to explain how their results fit into what's currently known about a topic, and how the results of their study either creates new questions or provides some answers to questions that already existed with the extant literature. So the best manuscripts are those that will be able to explain to you how the data presented in the study really moves us forward in some way.
Okay, great points. Last question we ask of prospective reviewers is, give us a sense, is this an ethical manuscript? And there's various dimensions to that. Jack, I know you're an expert on this, having chaired the program committee and had leadership venues and many other organizations. What's your thoughts on what a reviewer should look for in terms of the ethics of a manuscript?
I think it's very important for them to look at ethical considerations. Obviously, we want to make sure that as subjects or as animals were recruited, it was done in the proper manner. You want to look in, first of all, and see if there is local IRB approval or animal care committee approval, to see if a peer review group locally in their institution has judged this to be sound from an ethical standpoint. Beyond that, you want to, within your own sense of understanding the Belmont report and other factors of that sort, were the subjects treated fairly? Was confidentiality maintained? Were there things that were done in terms of the experimental design that we still think may be unethical or questionable, despite the fact of what the IRB says? And we'll see this from time to time, as you know. So I think you need to, first of all, as a first blush, make sure they have institutional review, but don't satisfy yourself that that's a sufficient judgment, and then look a little bit deeper as to how the subjects or the animals were chosen, how they were treated throughout the study.
Great, and I don't think the reviewer necessarily has the sole responsible here. And this is a point in general. As a reviewer, you're not out there alone. You have at least one other reviewer looking at the manuscript. You have an associate editor, the editor-in-chief, and the editorial staff, and sometimes even more reviewers will invite a tiebreaker. So you don't have to feel that the fate of the world rests on your shoulders with this manuscript. There is room for a learning process, and even making some mistakes along the way, they'll be picked up. Cecelia, you get a case series, and it says, we just did this as part of patient care. We don't really need this guy, Krouse, he's just a real curmudgeon. He wants us to go through all this paperwork and get RFB approval. This was just patient care. Do they need approval?
If they're going to publish it, yes. In my mind, they need to get approval.
In your mind, and in the IRB's mind as well, because if you're presenting it for QI purposes in your department or just for your own information, that's clinical care. You don't need approval, but once you would like to have the rest of the world benefit from your work, then it does need IRB. Any other ethical issues you'd like to bring up, Matt?
Well, I think clinical trials need to be registered with clinicaltrials.gov in advance of their performance. And that's a standard now that multiple journals are applying to try to deal with some issues with uneven reporting of clinical trial results.
So we've walked through the manuscript process, beginning with the relevance, the internal validity, the external validity. Is it adding to knowledge? And finally, is it ethical and appropriate? And the final comment I would make on the ethical and appropriate area is that as reviewers, you will see at the very start of the file you get to review the disclosures that the authors have provided regarding any potential conflicts of interest. And not all of them are necessarily conflicts, but you should look at those for every manuscript, and particularly if there are drugs or devices involved, see if those relationships could possibly influence the interpretation. And I'll say that simply declaring the relationships doesn't mean they're okay. It's really up to the reviewers and ultimately the editors to decide if those relationships, which may include intellectual relationships or things, may prevent a real unbiased assessment. Have there been times, Jack, that you've been doing this the longest, where you've just, they've declared everything, but it's just clear that the bias here is insurmountable?
Oh, absolutely. You'll see this around pharmaceutical products. You'll see it around devices, as you've said. And when they quoted the brand name of the product for the 50th time in the article, you begin to think that despite the disclosure, there may be something more going on here. So I think it's very important for reviewers, and you get a pretty good sense of it. I think if you just sort of trust your gut, you'll get a sense whether it passes the sniff test or not.
Right. It's really a gut response, and here, seeing the brand name 50 times when people name procedures or interventions after themselves, when you have authors of industry funding the project, analyzing the data, and they appear as authors on the manuscript, that's also of concern. So this has been great. I think we've done a real broad sweep of the process, and to tie it up, I'd ask each of you to give any pearls or words of wisdom that you have beyond what we've discussed to reviewers. Matt, we'll start with you.
When I'm writing a review, I approach it sort of like a book report. And what I try to do is really explain what the article is about to the editorial staff. And that means maybe a short introductory comment about the area under study and whether it's important or not. And then just very briefly, I include some information about the study design and the subjects and how they were selected, what the outcomes measures were used, and then what the results were. And after I have completed this brief explanation of what the study is about, then I usually make separate bulleted points about what I see as the particular strengths and weaknesses of the manuscript. And then also I try to make specific recommendations regarding how the manuscript can be improved. Because even if the article is ultimately rejected, we want the review process to be helpful to the submitting authors. So they may be able then to submit a better manuscript to another journal, for example, if they're rejected.
That's exactly right. And the purpose, and this brings up, what is the purpose of peer review? The purpose of peer review is, from a purely selfish perspective, it's to help the editor-in-chief understand manuscripts that might be a little beyond their area of expertise and to make intelligent decisions about those manuscripts. But it's also equally important that it is an educational process and a way to improve what we publish so the readership gets the best material presented in the best way. Some people are experts at conducting research and calculating the results, but they're not always the best experts in communicating that to the public or readership, and I think that's where we come in to fine-tune it. Cecelia, any additional comments?
Just given the title of this podcast, if you will, about becoming a star reviewer, when you start out, oftentimes you can get hung up on the grammar, and it's important to realize that as a reviewer, you just need to comment that the manuscript would benefit from review of someone well-versed in the English language, and not to feel like you are actually editing the manuscript, but you need to take a step back and actually review. I do want to reiterate Matt's point that I see my goal is twofold. One, to provide my associate editors and ultimately you the information within our field if this is worth publishing, but also to give positive, constructive criticism back to the researchers and writers. And oftentimes I will find that my more lengthier reviews will be the ones that I'm rejecting because I want to give them something to build upon. And the last thing that I really learned from your article when I was starting out is that it's not my job at the end of the review to say to the authors this should be rejected or accepted, but you just summarize enough, and ultimately that's a decision that's left into the hands of the associate editor.
And that's exactly right. It is your job, however, to render an opinion about the manuscript, but that is rendered to the editor in a separate section, and it would generally be accept, which would be extraordinarily rare on an initial manuscript, because usually there's always something we can do to make it a little better. A minor revision, which would mean it's probably going to be accepted, it just needs a little fine-tuning. Major revision, which would mean it may or may not be accepted. There are a lot of concerns here. If they can really address them, we might accept it, but there's a good chance we'll reject it. And then, of course, reject, meaning that it's pretty hopeless, we're not interested. And authors can repeal an rejection. We do get those, and as you know, sometimes it goes out for additional review. Matt, I guess you're the anchor. Jack, you're the anchor man on the words of wisdom, so they better be good.
Absolutely. I would agree with what's been said. I think it's very important for the reviewer to be not only the voice to the editorial staff, but the voice back to the authors. And I think that authors obviously put a large amount of time in a paper. They may not understand the issues at the level of the reviewers.
Right.
So I think it's very important to provide a detailed commentary back to them, not simply a sentence or two saying this is the worst article I've ever seen, reject. I mean, you need to really take the time that they deserve, put that time into it, and then I think as you do that, you become a better reviewer, you become better at being succinct and at writing and at communicating things in a way that's meaningful to others, and I think it's it's your own learning process as well.
Absolutely. This was, I think we should charge for this because I think you gave such great advice to the reviewers, potential reviewers. It's going to be a huge help. I really appreciate your being here and offering this. We would really like to encourage anyone interested to review for otolaryngology-head and neck surgery. As stated, you're not out there on a limb. There's a lot of support. If you make mistakes, don't worry, it's okay. To do that, you go to the journal homepage, which is www.otojournal.org. There is a tab that says Reviewer Information. You will be able to access a link to apply as a reviewer and let us know your email address and your topics of interest. It's important to select those topics carefully because those are the topics you'll get manuscripts to review on. You'll also be able to access free the full text of the article, How to Review Journal Manuscripts, which I think amplifies and clarifies on some of the topics here. So we appreciate your watching this vodcast and hope it was of help. Again, thank you. I'm the Editor-in-Chief, Rich Rosenfeld, and I owe particular thanks to Cecelia Schmalbach, star reviewer, now associate editor, Dr. Krouse, Jack Krouse, a star associate editor, although we don't have that designation yet. We might need to create it after this vodcast, and Matt Ryan, who is also a multiple star reviewer and associate editor. Thanks very much for tuning in.